We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, Chapter 9. Sometime during the night, an ambulance came and took Uncle Julian away, and I wondered if they missed his shawl, which was wound around Constance as she slept. I saw the ambulance lights turning into the driveway with the small red light on top, and I heard the distant sound of Uncle Julian's leaving, the voices speaking gently because they were in the presence of the dead, and the doors opening and closing. They called to us 2 or 3 times, perhaps to ask if they might have Uncle Julian, but their voices were subdued, and no one came into the woods. I sat by the creek wishing that I had been kinder to Uncle Julian. Uncle Julian had believed that I was dead, and now he was dead himself. Bow your heads to our beloved Mary Catherine, I thought, or you will be dead. The water moved sleepily in the darkness, and I wondered what kind of house we would have now. Perhaps the fire had destroyed everything and we would go back tomorrow and find that the past 6 years had been burned, and they were waiting for us, sitting around the dining room table, waiting for Constance to bring them their dinner. Perhaps we would find ourselves in the Rochester house, or living in the village, or on a houseboat on the river, or in a tower on top of a hill. Perhaps the fire might have persuaded to reverse itself and abandon our house and destroy the village instead. Perhaps the villagers were all dead now. Perhaps the village was really a great game board with the squares neatly marked out, and I had moved past the square which read fire, return to start, and was now on the last few squares, and only one move to reach home. Jonas's fur smelled of smoke. Today was Helen Clark's day to come to tea, but there would be no tea today, because we would have to neaten the house, although it was not the usual day for neatening the house. I wished that Constance had made sandwiches for us to bring down to the creek, and I wondered if Helen Clark would try to come to tea even though the house was not ready. I decided that from now on I would not be allowed to handle teacups. When it first began to get light, I heard Constance stirring on the leaves, and I went into my hiding place to be near her when she awakened. When she opened her eyes, she first looked at the trees above her and then at me and smiled. "We're on the moon at last," I told her, and she smiled. "I thought I dreamed it all," she said. "It really happened," I said. "Poor Uncle Julian. They came in the night and took him away, and we stayed here on the moon." "I'm glad to be here," she said. "Thank you for bringing me." There were leaves in her hair and dirt on her face, and Jonas, who had followed me into the hiding place, stared at her in surprise. He had never seen Constance with a dirty face before. For a minute she was quiet, no longer smiling, looking back at Jonas, realizing that she was dirty, and then said, "Mary Cat, what are we going to do?" "First, we must neaten the house, even though it's not the usual day." "The house?" she said. "Oh, Mary Cat." "I had no dinner last night," I told her. "Oh, Mary Cat." She sat up, untangled herself quickly from Uncle Julian's shawl and the leaves. "Oh, Mary Cat, poor baby," she said. "We'll hurry." And she scrambled to her feet. "First, you had better wash your face." She went to the creek and wet her handkerchief and scrubbed her face while I shook out Uncle Julian's shawl and folded it, thinking how strange and backwards everything was this morning. I had never touched Uncle Julian's shawl before. I had already saw the rules were going to be different, but it was odd to be folding Uncle Julian's shawl. Later, I found I would come back here to my hiding place and clean it and put in fresh leaves. "Mary Cat, you'll starve." "We have to watch," I said, taking her hand to slow her. "We have to go very quietly and carefully. Some of them may still be around waiting." I went first down to the path, walking silently while Constance and Jonas with Constance and Jonas behind me. Constance could not step as silently as I could, but she made very little sound, and of course Jonas made no sound at all. I took the path that would bring us out of the woods at the back of the house, near the vegetable garden, and when I came to the edge of the woods I stopped and held Constance back while we looked carefully to see if there were any of them left. For one first minute we saw only the garden and the kitchen door looking just as always, and Constance gasped and said, "Oh, Mary Cat, with a little moan, and I held myself very still because the top of our house was gone. I remember that I stood looking up at the house with love yesterday. I thought how it always had been so tall, reaching up into the trees. Today, the house ended above the kitchen doorway in a nightmare of black twisted wood. I saw part of a window frame holding broken glass, and I thought that was my window. I looked out that window from my room. There was no one there, and no sound. We moved together very slowly towards the house, trying to understand its ugliness and ruin and shame. I saw that ash had drifted among the vegetable plants. The lettuce would have to be washed before we could eat it, and the tomatoes. No fire had come this way, but everything, the grass and the apple trees and the marble bench in Constance's garden, had an air of smokiness, and everything was dirty. As we came closer to the house, we saw more clearly that the fire had not reached the ground floor, but it had had to be content with the bedrooms and the attic. Constance hesitated at the kitchen door, but she had opened it 1,000 times before and ought to surely recognize that touch of her hand, so she took the latch and lifted it. The house seemed to shiver when she opened the door, although one more draught could hardly chill it now. Constance had to push at the door to make it open, but no burned timber crashed down, and there was not, as I half thought there might be, a sudden rushing falling together as the house, seemingly solid, but really made up only of ash, might dissolve at a touch. "My kitchen," Constance said, "my kitchen." She stood in the doorway looking. "I thought that we had somehow not found our way back correctly through that night, that we somehow lost ourselves and come back through the wrong gap in time, or the wrong door, or the wrong fairy tale." Constance put her hand against the door frame to steady herself, and said again, "My kitchen, Mary Cat." "My stool is still there," I said. The obstacle which made the door hard to open was the kitchen table, turned on its side. I set it upright, and we went inside. 2 of the chairs had been smashed, and the floor was horrible with broken dishes and glasses and broken boxes of food and paper torn from the shelves. Jars of jam and syrup and ketchup had been scattered against the walls. The sink where Constance washed her dishes was filled with broken glass, and though glass after glass had been broken there methodically one after another. Drawers of silverware and cookingware had been pulled out and broken against the table and the walls, and silverware that had been in the house for generations of Blackwood wives was laying bent and scattered on the floor. Tablecloths and napkins hemmed by Blackwood women, and washed and ironed again and again, mended and cherished, that had been ripped from the dining room sideboard and dragged across the kitchen. It seemed that all the wealth and hidden treasure of our home had been found out and torn and soiled. I saw broken plates which had come from the top shelves of the cupboard, and our little sugar bowl with roses lay almost at my feet, handles gone. Constance bit down and picked up a silver spoon. "This was our grandmother's wedding pattern," she said, and set the spoon on the table. And then she said, "The preserves," and turned to the cellar door. It was closed, and I hoped that perhaps they had not seen it, or perhaps not had time to go down the stairs. Constance picked her way carefully across the floor and opened the cellar door and looked down. I thought of the jars and jars so beautifully preserved laying in broken sticky heaps in the cellar, and Constance went down in a step or two and said, "No, it's all right. Nothing's been touched." She closed the cellar door again and made her way across the sink to wash her hands and dry them on a dish towel from the floor. "First, your breakfast," she said. Jonas sat on the doorstep in the growing sunlight, looking at the kitchen with astonishment. Once he raised his eyes to me, and I wondered if he thought that Constance and I had made this mess. I took a cup, not broken, and picked it up and set it on the table, and then thought to look for more things which might have escaped. I remembered that one of our mother's Dresden figures had rolled safely onto the grass, and I wondered if it had hidden successfully and preserved itself. I would look for it later. Nothing was orderly, and nothing was planned. It was not like any other day. Only Constance went into the cellar and came back with arms full. Vegetable soup, she said, almost singing, and strawberry jam, and chicken soup, and pickled beef. She set the jars on the kitchen table and turned slowly, looking down at the floor. There, she said at last, and went to the corner to pick up the small saucepan. And then, the sudden thought, she set down the saucepan and made her way into the pantry. Meerkat, she called with laughter. They didn't find the flour in the barrel, or the salt, or the potatoes. They found the sugar, I thought. The floor was gritty and almost alive under my feet. And I thought, of course they would go looking for the sugar and have a lovely time. Perhaps they had thrown handfuls of sugar at one another, screaming, Blackwood sugar, want a taste? They got they got to the pantry shelves, Constance went on, and the cereals and the spices and the canned food. I walked slowly around the kitchen, looking at the floor. I thought that they had probably tumbled things by the armload, because cans of food were scattered and bent, as though they had been tossed in the air, and boxes of cereal and tea and crackers had been trampled underfoot and broken open. The tins of spices were all together thrown into a corner unopened. I thought I could still smell the faint, spicy scent of Constance's cookies, and then saw some of them crushed on the floor. Constance came out of the pantry carrying a loaf of bread. Look what they didn't find, she said. And there were eggs and milk and butter in the cooler. Since they had not found the cellar door, they had not found the cooler just inside. And I was pleased that they had not discovered eggs to mix into the mess on the floor. At one time I found 3 unbroken chairs and set them where they belonged around the table. Jonas sat in the corner on my stool watching us. I drank chicken soup from a cup without a handle, and Constance washed a knife to spread butter on the bread. Although I did not perceive it then, time and the orderly pattern of our old days had ended. I don't know when I found the 3 chairs, and when I ate the buttered bread, whether I'd found the chairs and then eaten the bread, or whether I'd eaten first, or even done both at once. Once Constance turned suddenly and put down her knife. She started for a closed door to Uncle Julian's room, and then turned back, smiling a little. I thought I heard him walking, she said, and sat down again. We had not been out of the kitchen. We still didn't know how much of the house was left to us, or what we might find waiting beyond the closed door into the dining room and the hall. We sat quietly in the kitchen, grateful for the chairs and the chicken soup, and the sunlight coming through the doorway, not yet ready to go farther. What will they do to Uncle Julian? I asked. They will have a funeral, Constance said with sadness. Do you remember the others? I was in the orphanage. They let me go to the funerals of the others, I can remember. They will have a funeral for Uncle Julian, and the Clarks will go, and the Carringtons, and certainly little Mrs. Wright. They will tell each other how sorry they are. They will look to see if we are there. I felt them looking to see if we were there, and I shivered. They will bury him like the others. I would like to bury something for Uncle Julian, I said. Constance was quiet, looking at her fingers, which lay still and long on the table. Uncle Julian is gone, and the others, she said. Most of our house is gone, Mary Cat. We are all that is left. Jonas. We are going to lock ourselves in more securely than ever. But today is the day Helen Clark comes to tea. No, she said, not again, not here. As long as we sat quietly in the kitchen, it was possible to postpone seeing the rest of the house. The library books were still on their shelf untouched, and I suppose that no one wanted to touch books belonging to the library. There was a fine after all for destroying library property. Constance, who was always dancing, seemed now unwilling to move. She sat on at the kitchen table with her hands spread before her, not looking around at the destruction, and almost dreaming, as though she had never believed that she had wakened this morning at all. We mustn't in the house, I said to her uneasily, and she smiled across at me. When I felt that I could not wait any longer, I said, I'm going to look. And I got up and went to the dining room. She watched me, not moving. When I opened the door to the dining room, there was a shocking smell of wetness and burned wood and destruction, and glass from tall windows laid across the floor, and silver tea service had been swept from the sideboard and stamped into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes. Chairs were broken here, too, and I remembered that they had taken up chairs and hurled them at the windows and walls. I went through the dining room and into the front hall. The front door stood wide open, and early sunlight laid in patterns along the floor of the hall, touching broken glass and torn cloth. After a minute, I recognized the cloth had as the drawing room tapestries, which was our mother had once had made 14 feet long. No one was outside. I stood in the open doorway and saw that the lawn was marked with the tires of cars and the feet which had danced, and where the hoses had gone, there were puddles and mud. The front porch was littered, and I remembered the neat pile of partly broken furniture which Harler, the junk dealer, had set together last night. I wonder if he had planned to come today with a truck and gather up everything he could, or if he had put the pile together because he loved great piles of broken things and could not resist stacking junk wherever he found it. I waited in the doorway to be sure that no one was watching, and then I ran down the steps across the grass and found our mother's Dresden figure unbroken, where it was hidden against the roots of a bush. I thought to take it to Constance. She was still sitting quietly at the kitchen table, and when I put the Dresden figure down before her, she looked for a minute and then took it in her hands and held it up to her cheek. It was all my fault, she said. Somehow, it was all my fault. I love you, Constance, I said. I love you, Mary Cat. And will you make that little cake for Jonas and me, pink frosting with gold leaves around the edge? She shook her head, and for a minute I thought she was not going to answer me. And then she took a deep breath, then stood up. First, she said, I'm going to clean this kitchen. What are you going to do with that? I asked her, touching the Dresden figure with the very tip of my finger. Put it back where it belongs, she said, and I followed her as she opened the door to the hall and made her way down the hall to the drawing room doorway. The hall was less littered than the rooms because there had been less in it to smash. There were fragments carried from the kitchen, and we stepped on spoons and dishes which had been thrown here. I was shocked when we came into the drawing room to see our mother's portrait looking down on us graciously while her drawing room lay destroyed around her. The white wedding cake trim was blackened with smoke and soot and would never be clean again. I disliked seeing the drawing room even more than the kitchen or the dining room because we had always kept it so tidy. Our mother had loved this room. I wondered which of them had pushed over Constance's harp, and I remembered that I had heard it cry out as it fell. The rose brocade of the chairs was torn and dirty, and smudged with the marks of wet feet that had kicked at the chairs and stamped on the sofa. The windows were broken here too, with the drapes torn down. We were clearly visible from outside. I think I can close the shutters, I said, as Constance hesitated in the doorway, unwilling to come further into the room. I stepped out onto the porch through the broken window, thinking that no one had ever come this way before, and found that I could unhook the shutters easily. The shutters were as tall as the windows. Originally, it was intended that a man with a ladder would close the shutters when the summers were ended and the family went to the city house. But so many years had passed since the shutters were closed that the hooks had rusted, and I needed only to shake the heavy shutters to pull the hooks away from the house. I swung the shutters closed, but I could only reach the lower bolt to hold them. There were two more bolts high above my head. Perhaps some night I might come out here with a ladder, but the lower bolt would have to hold them now. As I closed the shutters on both tall drawing room windows, I went along the porch and in, formally, through the front door and into the drawing room where Constance stood in dimness now, without the sunlight. Constance went to the mantel and set the Dresden figure in its place below the portrait of our mother, and for one quick minute the shadowy great room came back together again, as it should be, and then fell apart forever. We had watched carefully because of the broken things on the floor. Our father's safe lay just inside the drawing room, and I laughed, and even Constance smiled because it had not been opened, and it had clearly not been possible to carry it further than this. Foolishness, Constance said, and touched the safe with her toe. Our mother had always been pleased when people admired her drawing room, but now no one could come to the windows and look in, and no one would ever see it again. Constance and I closed the drawing room door behind us and never opened it afterwards. Constance waited just now inside the front door while I went into the porch again and closed the shutters over the tall dining room windows. And then I came inside and we shut and locked the front door, and we were safe. The hall was dark, and the two narrow lines of sunlight coming through the two narrow glass panels set on either side of the door. We could look out outside through the glass, but no one could see in, even by putting their eyes up close, because the hall inside was dark. Above us, the stairs were black and led into blackness and burned rooms with incredibly tiny spots of sky showing through. Until now, the roof had always hidden us from the sky, but I didn't think that there were any ways we could be vulnerable from above, and I closed my mind against the thought of silent winged creatures coming out of the trees above to perch on the broken burnt rafters of our house, peering down. I thought it might be wise to barricade the stairs by putting something, a broken chair perhaps, across. A mattress soaked and dirty lay halfway down the stairs. This was where they had stood with their hoses and fought the fires back and out. I stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up, wondering where our house had gone. The walls and the floors and the beds and the boxes of things in the attic. Our father's watch was burned away, and our mother's tortoise-shell dressing set. I could breathe a breath of air on my cheek. I could feel a breath of air on my cheek. It came from the sky, I could see, but it smelled of smoke and ruin. Our house was a castle, turreted and open to the sky. Come back to the kitchen, Constance said. I can't stay out here. Like children hunting for shells or two old ladies going through dead leaves looking for pennies, we shuffled along the kitchen floor with our feet, turning over broken trash to find things which were still whole and useful. When we had been along and across and diagonally through the kitchen, we had gathered together a little pile of practical things on the kitchen table, and there was quite enough for the two of us. There were 2 cups with handles and several without, and half a dozen plates and 3 bowls. We had been able to rescue all of the cans of food undamaged, and there were cans of spice which went neatly back onto their shelf. We found most of the silverware and straightened most of it as well as we could and put it back into the proper drawers. And since every one Blackwood bride had brought their own silverware and china and linen to the house, we had dozens of butter knives and soup ladles and cake servers. Our mother's best silverware had been in the tarnish-proof box in the dining room sideboard, and they had not found it and scattered it on the floor. One of our whole cups was green, with a pale yellow inside, and Constance said that one could be mine. I never saw anyone use it before, she said. I suppose a grandmother or great-great-aunt brought that set to the house as her wedding china. There were once plates to match. The cup which Constance chose was white with orange flowers, and one of the plates matched that. I remember when we used those dishes, Constance said. They were the everyday china when I was very small. The china we used for best then was white with gold edges. Then Mother brought new china, and the white and gold china was used for every day, and these flower dishes went into the pantry shelf with the other half-broken sets. The first few years I had always used Mother's everyday china, except when Helen Clark came to tea. We will take our meals like ladies, she said, using cups with handles. When we had taken everything out we wanted and could use, Constance got the heavy broom and swept up the rubble into the dining room. Now we won't have to look back at it, she said, and she swept the hall clear so we could go from the kitchen to the front door without passing through the dining room. And then we closed all the doors to the dining room and never opened them again. I thought of the Dresden figure standing small and courageous under our mother's portrait in the dark drawing room, and I remembered that we would never dust it again. Before Constance swept away the torn cloth that had been the drawing room drapes, I asked her to cut me off a piece of the cord which had once drawn them open and shut, and she cut me off a piece with a golden tassel on the end. I wondered if it might be the right thing to bury for Uncle Julian. When we finished, and Constance had scrubbed the kitchen floor, and our house looked clean and new, from the front door to the kitchen door everything was clear and swept. So many things were gone from the kitchen, and it looked bare. but Constance put our cups and plates and bowls on a shelf and found a pan to give Jonas milk, and we were quite safe. The front door was locked, and the kitchen door was locked and bolted, and we were sitting at the kitchen table drinking milk from our 2 cups, and Jonas was drinking from his pan, when a knocking started at the front door. Constance ran to the cellar, and I stopped just long enough to be sure that the kitchen door was bolted, and then I followed her. We sat on the cellar steps in the darkness and listened. Far away at the front door, the knocking went on, and then a voice called, "Constance! Mary Catherine!" "It's Helen Clark," Constance said in a whisper. "Do you think she's come for tea?" "No, never again." As we had both known she would, she came around the house calling us. When she knocked on the kitchen door, we held our breath, neither of us moving, because the top half of the kitchen door was glass, and we knew she could see in. But we were safely on the cellar stairs, and she could not open the door. "Constance, Mary Catherine, are you in there?" She shook the door handle as people do when they want the door to open, and think to catch it unaware and slip in before the lock can hold. "Jim," she said, "I know they're in there. I can see something cooking on the stove. You've got to open the door," she said, raising her voice. "Constance, come and talk to me. I want to see you, Jim," she said. "They're in there. They can hear me. I know it." "I'm sure they can hear you," Jim Clark said. They can probably hear you in the village." "But I'm sure they misunderstood the people last night. I'm sure Constance was upset, and I must tell her that nobody meant any harm. Constance, listen to me, please. We want you and Mary Catherine to come to our house until we can decide what to do with you. Everything's all right, really it is. We're going to forget all about it." "Do you think that she'll push over the house?" I whispered to Constance, and Constance shook her head wordlessly. "Jim, do you think you could break down the door?" "Certainly not. Leave them alone, Helen. They'll come out when they're ready." "But Constance takes these things so seriously. I'm sure she's frightened now." "Leave them alone." "They can't be left alone. This is absolutely the worst possible thing for them. I want them out of there and home with me where I can take care of them." "They don't seem to want to come," Jim Clark said. "Constance, Constance, I know you're in there, and come and open the door." I was thinking that we might very well put a cloth or a piece of cardboard over the window and the kitchen door. It simply would not do to have Helen Clark constantly peering and watching pots cooking on the stove. We could pin the curtains across the kitchen windows, and perhaps if the windows were all covered, we could sit quietly at the table while Helen Clark came pounding outside, and not have to hide on the cellar stairs. "Let's leave," Jim Clark said. "They're not going to answer you." "But I want to take them home with me." We did what we could. "We'll come back another time, when they feel more like seeing you." "Constance, Constance, please answer me." Constance sighed and tapped her fingers irritably and almost noiselessly at the stairwell. "I wish she'd hurry," she said into my ear. "My soup is going to boil over." Helen Clark called again and again, going back around the house to their car, calling, "Constance, Constance," as though we might be somewhere in the woods, up a tree perhaps, or under the lettuce leaves, or waiting to spring out at her from behind a bush. When we heard the car start and distantly, we came up from the cellar and Constance turned off her soup. I went along the hall to the front door to be sure they had gone, and the door was safely locked. When I saw their car turn out of the driveway, I thought I could still hear Helen Clark calling, "Constance, Constance." "I certainly wanted her tea," I said to Constance when I came back into the She certainly wanted her tea. I said to Constance as I came back into the kitchen. "We only have 2 cups with handles," Constance said. "She will never take tea here again." It's a good thing Uncle Julian's gone, or one of us would have to use a broken cup. "Are you going to neaten Uncle Julian's room?" "Mericat," Constance turned from the stove to look at me. "What are we going to do? We've neatened the house. We've had food. We've hidden from Helen Clark. What are we going to do? Where are we going to sleep? Where are we going to know what time it is? How are we going to know what time it is? What will we wear for clothes? Why do we need to know what time it is? Our food won't last forever, even the preserves. We can sleep in my hiding place by the creek." "No, that's all right. That's all right for hiding, but you must have a real bed." "I saw a mattress on the stairs. For my own bed, perhaps we can pull it down and clean it and dry it in the sun when corner is burned." "Good," Constance said. We went together to the stairs and took hold of the mattress awkwardly, and it was unpleasantly wet and dirty. We dragged it, pulling together along the hall with little scraps of wood and glass coming with it, and and got it across Constance's clean kitchen floor into the kitchen door. Before unlocking the door, I looked carefully, and even when the door was opened, I went out to look around in every direction, but it was safe. We dragged the mattress out into the lawn and put it in the sun near our mother's marble bench. Uncle Julian used to sit here, I said. It'd be a good day today for Uncle Julian to sit in the sun. Hope he's warm when he died. Perhaps he remembered the sun for a minute. I had his shawl. I hope he didn't wish for it, Mary Cat. I'm going to plant something here where he used to sit. I'm going to bury something for him. What will you plant? A flower. Constance leaned and touched the grass softly. Some kind of yellow flower. It's going to look funny right in the middle of the lawn. We'll know why it's there, and no one else will ever see it. And I will bury something yellow to keep Uncle Julian warm. First, however, my lazy Mary Cat, we will get a pot of water and scrub the mattress clean, and I will wash the kitchen floor again. We were going to be very happy, I thought. There were a great many things to do and a whole new pattern of days to arrange, but I thought we were going to be very happy. Constance was pale and still saddened by what had been done to her kitchen, but she scrubbed every shelf and washed the table again and again, and washed the windows and the floor. Our dishes were bravely on their shelf, and the cans of unbroken boxes of foods we had rescued made a substantial row in the pantry. I could train Jonas to bring back rabbits for stew, I told her, and she laughed, and Jonas looked back at her blandly. That cat is so used to living on cream and rum cakes and buttered eggs that I doubt he could catch a grasshopper, she said. I don't think I could care for grasshopper stew. At any rate, right now, I'm going to make an onion pie. While Constance washed the kitchen, I found a heavy cardboard carton, which I took apart carefully, and so had several large pieces of cardboard to cover the glass window and the kitchen door. The hammer and the nails were in the tool shed where Charles Blackwood had put them after trying to mend the broken step. I nailed the cardboard across the two kitchen windows, and the kitchen was dark but safe. It'd be safer to let the kitchen windows get dirty, I told Constance. But she was shocked, and she said I wouldn't live in a house with dirty windows. When we had finished, the kitchen was very clean, but could not sparkle because there was so little light, and I knew that Constance was not pleased. She loved sunshine and brightness and cooking in a light, lovely kitchen. We can keep the door open, I said, if we watch carefully all the time. We'll hear if any cars stop in front of the house. And when I can, I said, I will try to think of a way to build barricades along the sides of the house so no one will come around or be able to come around here to the back. I'm sure Helen Clark will come again. At any rate, she can't look in now. The afternoon was drawing in. Even the door opened. The sunlight came only a short way across the floor, and Jonas came to Constance at the stove, asking for his supper. The kitchen was warm and comfortable and familiar and clean. It would be very nice to have a fireplace in here, I thought. We could sit beside a fire, and then I thought, no, we have already had a fire. I will go and make sure that the front door is locked, I said. The front door was locked, and no one was outside. When I came back into the kitchen, Constance said, tomorrow I will clean Uncle Julian's room. We have had so little house left that it should all be very clean. Will you sleep in there? In Uncle Julian's bed? No, Mary Cat. I want you to sleep in there. It's the only bed we have. I'm not allowed in Uncle Julian's room. She was quiet for a minute, looking at me curiously, and then said, even though Uncle Julian's gone, Mary Cat? Besides, I found the mattress and cleaned it, and it came from my bed. I want it on the floor in my corner. Silly Mary Cat. Anyway, I'm afraid we'll both have the floor tonight. The mattress will not dry before tomorrow, and Uncle Julian's bed is not clean. I can bring branches from my hiding place and leaves. On my kitchen floor? I'll get the blanket, though, and Uncle Julian's shawl. You're going out now? All that way? No one's outside, I said. It's almost dark, and I can go very safely. If anyone comes, close the door and lock it. If I see that the door is closed, I will wait by the creek until I can come safely home, and then I will take Jonas for protection. I ran all the way to the creek, but Jonas was faster, and was waiting for me when I got to my hiding place. It was so good to run. Or it was good to run, and good to come back again to the house to see the kitchen door standing open and the warm light inside. And Jonas and I came in, and I shut the door and bolted it. We were ready for the night. It's a good dinner, Constance said, warm and happy from cooking. Come and sit down, Mary Cat. With the door shut, she had to turn on the ceiling light, and the dishes on the table were neatly set. Tomorrow I will try to polish the silverware, she said, and we must bring in things from the garden. The lettuce is full of ashes. Tomorrow too, Constance said, looking at the black squares of the cardboard which covered the windows. I'm going to try to think of some curtains to hide your cupboard. Tomorrow I will barricade the sides of the house. Tomorrow Jonas will catch us a rabbit. Tomorrow I will guess for you what time it is. Far away in the front of the house a car stopped, and we were silent, looking at one another now. And I thought, now we will know how safe we are, and I got up and made sure that the kitchen door was bolted. I could not see out through the cupboard, and I was sure that they could not see in. The knocking started at the front door, and there was no time to make sure that the front door was locked. They knocked only for a moment, as though certain that we would not be in the front of the house. And then we heard them stumbling in the darkness as they tried to find their way around the side of the house to the back. I heard Jim Clark's voice, and another which I remembered was the voice of Dr. Levy. Can't see a thing, Jim Clark said. Black as sin out there. There's a crack of light at one of the windows. Which one? I wondered which window still showed a crack. They're in there all right, Kim Clark said. No place else they could be. I just want to know if they're hurt or sick. Don't like to think of them shut up in there needing help. I'm supposed to bring them home with me, Jim Clark said. They came to the back door. Their voices were directly outside, and Constance reached out her hand across the table at me. If it seemed that they might be able to look in, we could run together from the cellar. Damn place is all boarded up, Jim Clark said, and I thought, good. Oh, that's good. I'd forgotten that there were real boards in the tool shed. I never thought of anything but cardboard, which is much too weak. Miss Blackwood, the doctor called, and one of them knocked on the door. Mrs. Blackwood, it's Dr. Levy. And Jim Clark, Helen's husband. Helen's very worried about you. Are you hurt? Sick? Do you need help? Helen wants you to come to our house. She's waiting for you there. Listen, the doctor said, and I thought he had his face very close to the glass, almost touching it. And he talked in a very friendly voice and said, and quietly, listen, no one's going to hurt you. We're your friends. We came all over here to help you and make sure you are all right. We don't want to bother you. As a matter of fact, we promise not to bother you at all, ever again. If you just once say that you are well and safe, just one word. We can't just let people go on worrying about you, Jim Clark said. Just one word, the doctor said. All you have to do is say you're all right. They waited. I could feel them pressing their faces to the glass, longing to see inside. Constance looked at me across the table and smiled a little, and I smiled back. Our safeguards were good, and they could not see in. Listen, the doctor said, and he raised his voice a little. Listen, Julian's funeral is tomorrow, and we thought you'd want to know. There are a lot of flowers already, Jim Clark said. You'd be really pleased to see all the flowers. We sent the flowers and the Wrights and the Carringtons. I think you'd feel a little different about your friends if you could see the flowers, and we all sent Julian. I wonder why they would feel different if we saw who sent Uncle Julian flowers. Certainly Uncle Julian, buried in flowers, swarmed over by flowers, would not resemble the Uncle Julian we had seen every day. Perhaps masses of flowers would warm Uncle Julian's dead. I tried to think of Uncle Julian dead and could only remember him asleep. I thought of the Clarks and the Carringtons and the Wrights pouring armfuls of flowers down onto poor Uncle Julian's helplessly dead. You're not going to gain anything by driving away your friends, you know. Helen said to tell you. Listen, I could feel them pushing against the door. No one's going to bother you. Just tell us, are you all right? We're not going to keep coming, you know. There is a limit of how much friends can take. Jonas yawned. In silence, Constance turned and slowly and carefully back to her place at the table, and took up the buttered biscuit and took a tiny silent bite. I wanted to laugh and put my hands over my mouth. Constance eating a biscuit silently was funny, like a doll pretending to eat. "Damn it," Jim Clark said, and knocked on the door. "Damn it," he said. "For the first time," the doctor said. "We know you're in there. For the first time, will you just—" "Oh, come away," Jim Clark said. "It's not worth all the yelling." "Listen," the doctor said, and I thought that he had his mouth against the door. "One of these days, you're going to need help. You'll be sick or hurt. You'll need help. And you'll be quick enough to—" "Leave him alone," Jim Clark said. "Come on." I heard their footsteps going around the side of the house and wondered if they were tricking us, pretending to walk away and then silently coming back to stand without sound outside the door, waiting. I thought of Constance, silently eating a biscuit inside, and Jim Clark silently listening outside, and a little cold chill went up my back. Perhaps they would never be noise in the world again. Then the car started at the front of the house, and we heard it drive away, and Constance put her fork down on her plate, a little crash, and I breathed again and said, "Where have you got that Uncle Julian? Where have they got Uncle Julian, do you suppose?" "At the same place," Constance said absently, "in the city, Merricat," she said, looking up suddenly. "Yes, Constance?" "I want to say I'm sorry. I was wicked last night." I was still and cold, looking at her and remembering. "I was very wicked," she said. "I should have never reminded you of why they all died." "Then don't remind me now." I could not move my hand up over to take hers. "I wanted you to forget about it. I never wanted to speak about it ever, and I'm sorry I did. I put it in the sugar." "I know. I knew then." "You never use sugar." "No. So I put it in the sugar." Constance sighed. "Merricat," she said. "We'll never talk about it again. Never." I was chilled, but she smiled at me kindly, and it was all right. "I love you, Constance," I said. "I love you, my Merricat." Jonas sat on the floor and slept on the floor, sat on the floor and slept on the floor, and I thought it ought to be so difficult for me. Constance should have had leaves and soft moss under our blankets, but we could not dirty the kitchen floor again. I put my blanket in the corner near my stool because it was the place I knew best, and Jonas got up onto the stool and sat there, looking down on me. Constance lay on the floor near the stove. It was dark, but I could see the paleness of her face across the kitchen. "Are you comfortable?" I asked her, and she laughed. "I've spent a lot of time in this kitchen," she said, "and I've never before tried lying on its floor. I've taken such good care of it that it has to make me welcome, I think. Tomorrow we will bring in the lettuce."